is an off week for us where we're doing regular reactions that are not mostly copyrighted content.
Yep.
And one does not simply escape Simon Whistler on YouTube.
No.
Especially when we're talking about the British Empire, the good, bad, and ugly details of the world's largest empire.
I feel like I can't wait to hear this.
And can't wait to see what the comment section says too.
Yeah.
This will be quite interesting. Are you
Yep.
ready?
Yeah, let's do it, man.
3, 2, 1.
Hello everybody, welcome back to another Megaprojects video. This one's all about the British Empire. A video where I'm going to have to be very, very careful. Said to be the empire on which the sun never set, the British Empire at its peak covered an extraordinary quarter of the landmass of the world, despite Britain itself accounting for just 242,495 square kilometers, about 94,000 square miles, making it only the 80th largest country in the world, wedged between Guinea and Uganda in terms of size, just in case you're interested, and I bet you were. By 1913, the British Empire included some 412 million people scattered across 7 different continents, and the 2 world wars of the 20th century saw soldiers drawn from all corners of the globe to fight under the British banner. The scale of the British Empire was astonishing, and the fact that such a small island was able to exert so much control over so much land is a feat that may never be achieved again. But of course, this is a story that is far darker than mere nostalgic triumph. The tale of the British Empire is one that was often built upon the pain, suffering, and death of those that it sought to subjugate. The grand empire that expanded out from London may have reached new heights in terms of size, technological advancement, trade, and exploration, but it usually came at a painful cost, with effects that are still felt today. We're not going to sugarcoat the British Empire today, but equally so, we're not going to present you with 20 minutes worth of colonial horror, although we probably could. This is a topic that has become decidedly dicey to discuss in recent years, but avoiding talk about history rarely gets us anywhere. The story of
I appreciate that he's saying right up front that we're not going to sugarcoat it, but we're not going to just completely shit on it.
Yeah, it's ridiculous to think that history is just rainbows and sparkles. Like it's dark and full of blood and death.
Yeah.
It's history.
Yeah, and I'd be curious to see how it's taught in British schools, and like because we learned over on ETG how World War II was taught in schools, and the general consensus was they didn't sugarcoat stuff.
No,
when it came to that era, and definitely in the United States, a lot of stuff about our history is sugarcoated.
Sugarcoated for a lot,
and it's not until we're adults that we learn the real truth. And
that's usually on our own. You know what I mean? Not in a curriculum.
No.
So
here we go.
Yep.
The rise of the British Empire is both horrifying and fascinating. So let's get into it. If we've learned anything about history, it's that empires rise and fall with a surprisingly regular pattern. Some last for decades, while others stretch to more than 1,000 years. But eventually, they all fall. The Pandian Empire is generally regarded as the longest-lasting empire in history, clocking up an impressive 1,850 years. Now, if you're scratching your head right now, wondering why on earth you've never heard of the Pandian Empire, well, that just reiterates my first point, and if you have heard of it, well done, you big brain. For those of you who don't know it, this empire was in southern India from around the 5th century AD. Now, if we're talking about size, then it's hard to look past the subject of our video today, because the British Empire eventually covered 35.5 million square kilometers, or close to 14,000 square miles. But if you're interested in the largest contiguous empire in history, and again, I'm absolutely certain you are, because who isn't, then we could talk about the second on this list, the Mongol Empire, which reached its peak in 1270 AD and covered 24 million square kilometers. That's 9.27 million square miles. That's 2.5 times the size of the US, by the way. They also butchered their way to success across the empire, killing maybe as many as 40 million people in the process, but, well, that's a story for another day. Indeed, a story we could well cover here on Megaprojects. Probably if this video does well, we will. Considering how large the British Empire grew in such a relatively short period, it's important to remember where it all came from, because you don't need to go back to find a fairly insignificant nation. The British were beaten into submission by the Romans from 43 AD onwards, who ruled over the islands for about 3.5 centuries. Once the Romans left, Britain saw Germanic Anglo-Saxons arrive along with Vikings from Scandinavia. It's also worth pointing out that Britain was not a unified country at this point, with England, Wales and Scotland operating independently, and at times with multiple groups fighting each other or begrudgingly coexisting. In 1066, Britain was invaded by the Normans, who eventually conquered Wales, most of Ireland, and gave it a damn good go up in Scotland. But if you've ever seen the movie Braveheart, you'll know how that one ended. Britain came under single rule in 1603 when James I of Scotland also inherited the English crown, and on May 1st, 1707, the Kingdom of Great Britain was officially formed under the Acts of Union, which were passed in both English and Scottish parliaments. Now,
wow, I thought it was a lot older than that. Was actual Great Britain, the unification of England, Scotland. I don't know if Wales was part of it at that point. Definitely was Ireland, Northern Ireland definitely wasn't part of it then either. But I thought it was a lot older.
Wow, that's
Definitely
that's
skipped
more
over.
recent than I thought. That's
Yeah.
I was like, wow, okay, cool.
Yeah. Now we know.
A few interesting things there, most notably the near constant bickering and conflict with the French and the fairly vicious civil war that tore the country apart between 1642 and 1651. So during the late 15th and early 16th century, Britain was hardly a major player on the world stage, and in fact it was just one of several European nations that would eventually compete for global supremacy. Most notably was Spain, who was already dominating South America and Portugal and had trading posts around the world, Holland, who were busy setting up colonies in Asia, South America and Africa, and of course the French, who began exploring and colonizing what is today Canada in 1534.
Those visual right there, that shows you how all the European nations that had a stranglehold on the world at that time, and particularly the United States as well, because Netherlands had New York, France had a lot of the Midwest and Louisiana and Florida, and like Spain had Florida, and England had the 13 colonies, obviously.
So it's crazy, man. It's just wild that they exported their dominance like that. It's pretty crazy. It's impressive, actually.
Yeah, and it helps us understand the cultural melting pot that is the United States and probably Canada as well, and like all of Latin America as well. Like how much of a cultural melting pot it is from European influence.
Yep.
Yeah.
My point is that Britain's place as would-be rulers of large swaths of the world was far from set at this point. In fact, if you had to place a bet on it by the end of the 15th century, you probably wouldn't have backed Britain. And what better foundation to build an empire on than piracy? That's right, considering how snooty we became over the coming centuries, it is somewhat ironic that it all began with Elizabeth I authorizing ships to intercept and plunder Spanish and Portuguese ships returning from America laden with treasure. When you think about Britain's first colony, you might be slightly surprised to find that it was much closer to home than some far-flung exotic location that would eventually make up the British Empire. Between the 1550s and 1620s, Britain began colonizing parts of Ireland, which essentially involved kicking the native Irish off their land and replacing them with British settlers. 400 years later, and we're still experiencing the sectarian hate that sprouted from these British colonies. The first
we checked out a video about how Ireland became so bitterly divided, and we talked about that there. So,
colony established further afield was the Roanoke colony in what is present-day South Carolina in 1585. Things didn't exactly go well here, and after a delayed return, it was found entirely abandoned in 1590, with no trace of its inhabitants ever found, apart from a cryptic message reading Croatoan carved into one of the buildings. And bizarre coincidence, I looked at what else I'm recording today, and I'm making a video about that very thing for another channel. There you have it. This was Britain's early foray across the Atlantic, but as we know, things progressed quickly from there. While they may have attempted to stake their claim in what would be the continental US quite early, it was the Caribbean that really held more interest to the British. Colonies in St. Lucia and Grenada were established in 1605 and 1609 respectively, but both collapsed quickly in the face of incessant pressure from the local populations. Things went better for the British in St. Kitts in 1624, Barbados in 1627, and Nevis in 1628, where Britain was able to establish sugar plantations in the same mold as the Portuguese in Brazil. This was followed by the annexation of Jamaica from the Spanish in 1655 and the colonization of Barbados in 1666. Further north, the first proper colony in what is now the United States was Jamestown in Virginia in 1607, and if you want to know more about that particular colony, we've already covered it here on Megaprojects, so why not take a look at that video after this one, where hey, things spread quickly from there, with several religious groups escaping persecution, along with others simply looking for the ultimate new start, arriving in the New World over the coming years, and the eventual establishment of the 13 colonies came next. Now, the British got involved in some pretty dark acts as the empire expanded, but we can't talk about the establishment of the colonies in the Americas without addressing the monstrous elephant in the room. It's estimated that British ships transported roughly 3.1 million African slaves across the Atlantic to work in plantations in the Caribbean and North America. And that's the number of how many left Africa, with a mortality rate of 1 in 7. Perhaps as many as 400,000 to 500,000 slaves died en route under the most horrifying conditions. To our modern minds, this is little more than utter savagery, but this practice was wholeheartedly condoned by British authorities until 1807, when they finally abolished slavery. And let's be brutally honest here, the slave trade was a spectacular financial success, and much of Britain's early power was built upon this horrifying industry, with cities like Liverpool, Glasgow, and Bristol growing exponentially on the back of slavery.
Well, good for not sugarcoating that part, to just telling it like it was. Yep. And I obviously it's a much more complex issue that I don't know if we'll ever cover it, because we're two white guys, and two, it's just something that we tend to like to keep things lighthearted around here, to be more escapism as opposed to talk about complex subjects, even though that's what we're doing right now.
Yeah, I mean, and then we're not, he is.
Right, so. Exactly. He is. We're learning here.
We're learning.
So. Exactly. Like I said in the beginning of the video, a lot of our history is sugar-coated, and it's not told to us like it was.
Yep.
And so, from one heinous exploitation to another. When the British first arrived in India in 1606, it's fair to say that few would have dared dream just how significant India would become to Britain, the jewel in the crown as it came to be known. But things were not so cut and dry here. In the early days, the British East India Company, an organization set up to facilitate trade in the Indian subcontinent, established a series of trading posts along the coast with the full consent of either local tribes or the Mughal emperor. Britain by no means invaded India, and in fact it joined a series of European nations that were trading with groups in the region. However, and you knew this was coming, the East India Company slowly but surely began worming their way into power by purchasing land and at times using intimidation or just outright violence. They may have seemed like fairly innocent traders when they arrived, but the East India Company, which I should add also had an army of over 250,000 men, evolved into an insidious organization that began to quietly dominate large areas of India. India proved to be a goldmine for the East India Company, and consequently for Britain also. One of the major commodities was opium, which was increasingly exported to China. This caused such an addiction problem, it was banned by the Qing dynasty in 1729. But the British weren't about to allow a perfectly profitable business to collapse? Oh no, and this resulted in not one but two opium wars, which led to British and eventually French troops barging their way into China to restore order, and which led to Britain's 99-year lease of Hong Kong, by the way. Apart from opium, the British profited handsomely from India by selling on its raw materials with huge markups while taxing the population to within an inch of their lives. Things exploded in 1857 with the Indian Rebellion, where the local population rose with greater force force than ever before, leading to the deaths of 6,000 British soldiers and, shockingly, perhaps as many as 800,000 Indian deaths. This was ultimately put down, but it led to the disbandment of the East India Company, with the British government taking formal control of India. But this was just the start. Famines had become a horrifying part of life in the Indian subcontinent, and the Great Famine between 1876 and 1878 claimed between 5 million and 15 million lives, depending on your source. This did lead to a series of policy changes that stabilized food production and distribution, and widespread famine was largely a thing of the past by the 20th century, with the major exception, of course, being the Bengal famine of 1943, in which up to 3 million people died.
Wow.
Before we move on, and to really give you an idea of the economic motherlode that India became to Britain, I'll leave you with the figure of $45 trillion. That is the number that the economist Utsa Patnaik recently calculated that Britain effectively made from its rule in India.
Wow.
Oh my God, it's a lot.
That's, that is.
I mean, who would think that, taxing them all and making them starve would cause an uprising? Who would have thought?
Yeah, but it made them $45 trillion.
Yeah, and where's it gone today? I'm sure there's people in the comments saying, where's it gone today?
Yeah, it's not, they don't have it.
Yeah. Oh, there we go.
Recently calculated that Britain effectively made from its rule in India. The first true sucker punch delivered to that British stiff upper lip came with the loss of the 13 colonies in what is today the United States. In the years that followed, the British would attempt to portray an air of ambivalence over the loss of their colonies across the Atlantic, but they certainly put up a hell of a fight over them. The American Revolutionary War began in 1775 and lasted 8 years, in which things swung back and forth. Had the British been more decisive in the early years, it's entirely likely that this particular war would have gone the other way, but as the Continental Army grew in size and confidence, they eventually prevailed. And yes, there were also the French, who supplied money, troops, armaments, and naval support that helped to tip the balance. This was a fact conveniently forgotten in 2003 with the furious American response to the French decision not to join the Second Gulf War. I bet the cowardly French felt rather embarrassed when the US and Britain finally found all those weapons of mass destruction. Apparently, sometimes on Megaprojects, we just like throwing hand grenades into the comment section, don't we? Why? Anyway.
What thoughts, Daniel?
Hey, I guess I'm happy the French exist, but I have my thoughts.
Yeah,
I have my thoughts on the whole thing.
We appreciate the French back in the 1700s, but other than that, like,
thanks for the fries.
Thanks for the. That's the Belgians. They gave
I know.
us those.
But it's still French fries.
Whatever.
Should have fought harder to make a Belgian fries, but
whatever. But
thanks for the fries.
Hey, us in Britain, we kissed and made up. We're fine now, for the most part.
For the most part.
Yep.
Britain's pain at losing the 13 colonies was eased considerably with another monstrous addition to the empire, Australia. While the Dutch had been the first Europeans to land on the continent in the late 17th century, it wasn't until James Cook landed there in 1770 that it was formally claimed by the British Crown. It's kind of unbelievable that someone could just land on a shore, raise a flag, and lay claim to a piece of land totaling 7.7 million square kilometers, or about 2.9 million square miles. Indeed, it was already a land populated by an indigenous population that had called it home for 65,000 years. And while we're talking about the Aborigines, Australia was claimed through proclamation rather than treaties, which had often been the case around the world for the simple and staggeringly obnoxious reason that the Aborigines were deemed too uncivilized to require treaties. And yes, everybody, the past was the worst. Britain began shipping convicts to Australia in 1787. The 13 colonies had been a favourite holiday spot for British criminals beforehand, but that particular resort was now under new ownership, and the vastness of Australia was seen as a perfect place to ship off all of those undesirables.
About to say, with both the 13 colonies and Australia being where they sent their prisoners, like, considering all the jokes about Britain, I haven't been yet, so I'm probably putting my foot in my mouth. I sure at least one person would be like, I'm Jack the Ripper. Take me over to South Carolina or, I don't know, Botany Bay.
Yeah, wow.
Lobsters the size of canoes over in Australia. Barbecue over in The Carolinas? Come on.
Yep. Yep. I feel like maybe that's I feel like maybe that's the reason that the Aussies and the Americas are kind of similar.
Yeah, yeah. They're like redneck, bogan, basically the same thing.
Yep.
Roughly 162,000 convicts made the journey up until 1868, but Australia was also proving to be hugely profitable for the Crown, with wool and gold paying off handsomely.
Africa, here we go.
As the 20th century dawned, the British Empire was approaching its peak, and I know we barely touched on much of it. If you're wondering about Africa, well, it all happened later. The British acquired its first colony in what is today South Africa from the Dutch in 1806, and slowly expanded from there, leading to an Anglo-Zulu War and two Boer Wars where the British suffered heavily, but managed to cling on. As for the rest of Africa, well, that leads us to another preposterous white colonial act that came to be known as the Scramble for Africa, where 7 European nations, Britain, France, Spain, Portugal, Belgium, and Italy, divided up Africa amongst themselves. Ever wondered about all those ludicrously straight lines that form many African borders? Well, now you know why. Britain, as the colonial superpower at the time, received the largest share and took it upon itself to try and civilize the natives. It's difficult to talk broadly about Britain's involvement in Africa because it was just so vast, but it often follows a fairly similar pattern. Usually, the British would choose a particular tribal ethnicity to rule over the rest of the country, which meant they could sometimes leave the dirty work up to others. The effects of this and the subsequent tribal hatred are still present to this day in Sudan and Nigeria, to name just two.
That's a whole other video of Britain's and the rest of Europe's involvement in Africa. Like I feel like that's such a complex subject that has a lot of.
So they boosted up certain tribes and had essentially proxy governments. Run that.
Yeah. They were the fools that did Europe's dirty work and UK in general.
Kept the hands clean for the most part.
Kept the hands clean. Yeah.
Okay.
The British Empire reached its peak in 1921. The First World War had been catastrophic for everybody involved, but Britain had gained territory from the Germans in Africa. The war had also seen roughly 3 million soldiers and labourers from across the empire fight for Britain, a figure that would be more than tripled during World War II. Britain may have staggered victoriously from the second major conflict of the 20th century, but it was the beginning of the end for the largest empire that the world had ever known, which at its peak included 57 colonies, dominions, territories, or protectorates. Quite simply, the nation just didn't have the money or the manpower to cover such a vast area, and one by one, full independence came to countries across the empire. And much of it was remarkably peaceful. By that point, Britain wasn't really in a position to be dictating terms and probably quite enjoyed the role of handing out independence, conveniently airbrushing the centuries of misrule out of the picture. In 1945, the number of those living within the British Empire outside of Britain itself was 700 million, but by 1965, that number had dropped to just 5 million.
Oh, wow.
Most of whom lived in Hong Kong. It's important to add that while many of the independence transitions were essentially peaceful, what came next often wasn't. One final accusation leveled against the departing British was that they failed to lay the groundwork for independence, and as a result, sometimes years later, things got horrific. In India, the decision to partition the nation, creating a new country, Pakistan, where Muslims could live, led to between 200,000 and 2 million deaths in the subsequent violence, with another 10 to 20 million displaced. Across Africa, countless new democracies emerged from colonization with great hope, only to become embroiled in civil wars that would define the final decades of the 20th century. If British rule could be terrible, the tribal hatred often stoked before independence sometimes led to absolute carnage.
There we go.
And that nearly brings us to an end of the story for the British Empire, a collection of territories, the dominions that eclipsed all before it. Today, the British Empire is long gone, but it's been replaced by the British Commonwealth, a group of 54 countries spread around the world. This is a voluntary organisation with some fairly vague benefits that include a single unified voice, development assistance, trade and academic links, defence treaties, and so forth. As I mentioned at the start of this video, there's a real darkness surrounding the British Empire that is often conveniently sidestepped. concept. It's a topic that certain British people sometimes feel a little uneasy discussing. But equally so, we've also arrived at a point where people can't stand the idea of talking about anything positive that might have come out of the British Empire, and surely both of those extremes are unhelpful in painting an accurate picture of what really happened. The British were responsible for millions of deaths and misery across the world. It essentially started the slave trade, often destroyed indigenous culture and exploited people in unimaginable ways. So, are there any positives we might be able to glean from the British Empire? Well, maybe a few. Infrastructure is probably the best and safest place to start, as railways, ports, schools and hospitals were built across the empire that are still in use today, while the introduction of modern technology, healthcare and education no doubt benefited many around the British Empire. The British were also the first to outlaw, then aggressively police slavery after 1807. Yes, they had started it. Yes, they got to the point where it wasn't particularly profitable anymore, and yes, you can bicker out the reasons behind it all you want, but those are the facts. Nowadays, people want to reduce the British Empire to either being good or bad, which completely misses the point. For a small number of people at the very, very top, the empire was a spectacular success as staggering fortunes were made. We can also say that modern Britain was built upon the scaffolding of the empire, and it's entirely likely that the country wouldn't be what it is today without it. But to parrot that the British Empire was good is plainly ridiculous and probably says a lot about modern delusions that we often see in the First World. Colonialism, whether the British or otherwise, should always be remembered as a dark stain on our history, but one that we can hopefully learn from. The concept of subjecting other people is a human trait that goes back thousands of years, and we're still trying to pick our way through the wreckage of some of the most recent attempts. History can be a dark place to delve into, but not looking back and examining closely is usually even worse.
That's a good way of wrapping it up, summing it up like that. Colonialism, it's a stain on any country's history. Yeah. And particularly the British Empire. In America, we have our own history of colonialism as well. So to say that either of those empires are good is completely not right. And it's also saying that they're bad is completely not right. Yep. It's a more complex issue than just good, bad. There's good that came out of all of it, and there's bad that came out of it that we should at least acknowledge and talk about. That way we can move forward and try not to repeat it in the years to come.
It's more so just acknowledging that it happened. It happened, and because of that, stuff that we are not in control of in the past shaped what is right now. Right. Because of those actions, those things that happened. It's just the way it was then, which is wild. It's just the way it was then. So it's crazy. It's crazy. But I like how he summed it up. Like you said, you have to be able to look back and understand it for what it is, which is not pretty.
Right.
It's just what was needed to get to where we are now, which is crazy.
100%. And it's, again, at the beginning of the video, I said that we talked about how Germany taught World War II and how it's acknowledging it and the results of that. Like, there's not a lot of German pride as there used to be. There still is, but it's not said out loud. And would I advertise my patriotism? I mean, all the time. I sometimes do, but not the 100% my thing. And I'd like to hear the commenters, do you feel proud to be British, knowing all of this? And I know it's being framed in a light that's not too pretty, so I'm just curious to hear y'all's thoughts about that.
Good to hear. It's gonna be an interesting comment section to read, to say the least.
Either way, thanks for watching. Consider subscribing and watching another video. Hopefully that's a little more happy and upbeat than what we just presented. What else, Dan?
Just unplug and do something legendary, guys.
Yep. And we'll see y'all next time.
Later.